Welcome to JS Online Tuitions, and today in biology we're going to look at sexual reproduction in flowering plants. We'll look at sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So sexual reproduction in flowering plants occurs through the flowers, so it is important to look at the structure of the flower. This is because this is where reproduction takes place. So as you can see from the diagram, I've already drawn this diagram, and it is showing the parts of the flower. So we have the stalk, we have the receptacle, we have the sepal, we have the ovary, we have the petals, we have the style, we have the filament, we have the anther, and we have the stigma. So it is important to know each part of a flower and its function. So the function of the stalk is to attach the flower to the branch. That's the function of the stalk. Then the function of the receptacle is to support all the parts of the flower. The function of the sepal is to protect the flower when it is still young. That's the function when it is still a bud. So the sepals, they protect flowers when they are still young. And the sepals, they are green in color, or they contain chlorophyll, and this means that photosynthesis can take place through the sepals. Then sometimes in other flowers, the sepals, they can be colored, and this means they will attract insects. Then coming to the petals, so the petals are usually colored. They can be colored yellow or orange, and the function of the petals is to attract insects. Then we have the anther and the filament. So the anther and the filament are collectively referred to as the stamen. So the stamen forms the male parts of the flower. So the male parts of the flower are referred to as the stamens, and we have the anther and the filament. The function of the anther is to produce the pollen grains, which are the male gametes of the flower. Then the function of the filament is to hold the anther in right position during pollination, so that pollination can take place. Also, the filament contains some vascular bundles, and these vascular bundles, they supply nutrients and water to the pollen grains that are developing on the anther. Then coming to the stigma, the style, and the ovary, this forms the female parts of the flower, and the female parts of the flower are referred to as the pistil. So the function of the stigma is to receive the pollen grain and to induce it so that it can germinate through it. That's the function of the stigma. Then the function of the style is to make sure that as the pollen grains arrives at the stigma, it can grow down so that it can reach the ovary. And the function of the ovary is to store the ovules, which are the female gametes of the flower. So those are the functions of the parts of the flower. I hope it's clear. Then when fertilization takes place, the ovary would develop into a fruit, and the ovules would develop into the seeds. So let us look at the functions that I've just said. Let me just write them down. So the first part, we have the stalk. So this attaches flowers to branches. Then we have the receptacle. The function of the receptacle is to support all the other parts of the flower. So this supports other parts of the flower. Then we have the sepals. This is used to protect flowers when they are still young. So protect flowers when young. When they are still in a bud. So we have the keyword bud here. Then we also have the petals. So the petals are usually made up of colored pigments. So they are made up of colored pigments. They're made up of colored pigments, and the petals, they're used to attract insects. So these, they attract insects. Then we have the anther and the filament. So we can just say the stamen. So the stamen forms the male parts of the flower. So the male parts of the flower and the male part of the flower is made up of the anther and the filament. So the filament is used to position the anther in the light position. So we have the filament. This is used to position the anther in the right position during pollination. Light position. So during pollination, they also contain the vascular bundles. So they have the vascular bundles, and the vascular bundles transport nutrients and water to the developing pollen grains. So they transport nutrients and water to the pollen grains. Then we have the anther. The function of the anther is to develop the pollen grains. So develop the pollen grains. And the pollen grains, these are the male gametes of the flower. So we know that the pollen grains are the male gametes of a flower. Let us now look at the female parts of the flower. So the female parts of the flower are collectively referred to as the pistil, and this includes the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So let us look at the functions of each of these parts. So the function of the stigma, this is to receive the pollen grains and induce them so that they can germinate. So this is used to receive pollen grains. And germinate them. Then the function of the style. So the style is where the pollen tube would develop, and the style will help to pass the pollen grains to the ovary. So this is where the pollen tube develops. Then the function of the ovary. The function of the ovary is to store the ovules. So store the ovules, and the ovules, these are the female gametes of the flower. So the ovules are the female gametes of the flower. So when fertilization takes place, the ovary develops into a fruit, and the ovules, they develop into seeds. So those are the parts of the flower and their functions. I hope it's clear. Where you have questions, you can ask in the group. Let us now look at pollination. So pollination is defined as the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the flower. So this is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers. This is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. That's pollination. So this is the transfer. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma, that is referred to as pollination. And sometimes you can be asked to define pollination in the exam. So that's the simple definition of pollination. And there are two types of pollination. We have self-pollination and cross-pollination. So there are two types of pollination. Two types, and we have self-pollination self-pollination and cross-pollination. Let us look at self-pollination. So self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So that's the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. That's self-pollination. So this is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Stigma of the same flower. And that means that there is no interchange of genetic properties here, because pollination occurs in a single flower, so there is no interchange of genetics. Then there are some disadvantages that goes by self-pollination. So the first disadvantage is that when self-pollination occurs, sometimes it can produce offsprings that may not grow, or sometimes it may produce the pollen grains that may not mature. And since there's no interbreeding during self-pollination, that means that the cells can be attacked by the pathogens and they can have some serious diseases. So those are the disadvantages. So disadvantages: so they may produce offsprings that may not grow, produce offsprings then the other disadvantage is that they may produce pollen grains that may not be able to mature. So produce seeds that may not be able to mature. Then the other disadvantage of self-pollination is that the offsprings, they can be attacked by the pathogens. So there's no inbreeding, and that means offsprings may be attacked. So cross-pollination is defined as the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a different flower, but it must be of the same species. So this is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same species. So that's the definition. So this is the transfer. So this is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but of the same species. So that's the definition of cross-pollination. So we are going to look at the differences between self-pollinated flowers and cross-pollinated flowers. So the first difference is that the stamens in the self-pollinated flowers are short, while the stamens in cross-pollinated flowers are long. So here the stamens are short, and here the stamens are long. And we know that the stamens, that's the male part of the flower, which includes the filament and the anther. Then the other difference is that for the self-pollinated flowers, they produce some chemicals. So here they produce some chemicals, then for the close-pollinated flowers, they don't produce chemicals. Then let us look at another difference. The other difference is that for the self-pollinated flowers, the anthers and the stigma, they mature at the same time. So the anthers and the stigma matures at the same time. And the main reason why the anther and the stigma matures at the same time, so if the anthers produces the pollen grains, and if the pollen grains they go to the stigma there is going to induce those pollen grains to grow, and as the pollen grains grow, they're going to fertilize the ovule. And since they are matured, which means fertilization is going to take place. That's why the anthers and the stigma, they mature at the same time for the self-pollinated flowers. Then for the cross-pollinated flowers, here the anthers and the stigma don't mature at the same time. So don't mature at the same time. Let us look at another difference. So the other difference is that for the self-pollinated flowers, most of the flowers, they face upwards. So here flowers face upwards, while for the close-pollinated flowers, they face downwards. So these are some of the differences between self-pollinated flowers and close-pollinated flowers. So let us now look at insect-pollinated flowers and wind-pollinated flowers. So pollination is brought about by the agent such as wind and insect. So there are some insect-pollinated flowers and wind-pollinated flowers. So let us look at the adaptation of insect-pollinated flowers. So adaptations. Adaptations of insect-pollinated flowers. So the first adaptation of insect-pollinated flowers is that the petals here are brightly colored. So petals are brightly colored, so the petals are brightly colored, and the reason why the petals are brightly colored is to attract the insect. So they attract insects. That's why the petals are brightly colored. Then the other adaptation is that these types of flowers, they are scented. So these are scented, and the main reason why they are scented is to attract insects. So attract insects. Let us look at another adaptation. So the other adaptation is that here the pollen grains that are produced are rough and sticky so that they can stick to the insects. So the pollen grains are rough and sticky, and the main reason why the pollen grains are sticky so that they can stick to the insects. Also the pollen grains, they are large, so the pollen grains are large. Then the other adaptation is that the stigma of insect pollinated flowers are sticky. So the stigmas here are sticky, and the main reason why the stigmas are sticky so that the pollen grains can be put on the surface of the stigma, or so that the pollen grains can stick on the stigma. Then the other adaptation is that these flowers have nectaries. have nectaries, and the nectaries produces nectar. So this produces nectar, and this is the main attraction of the insects. So as the insects comes to the flowers, they're going first to see the colors. As they see the colors, they're going to be attracted, and as they are attracted to those flowers, they'll go to the flowers, and as they reach the flowers, they'll want to get nectar. So as they are getting nectar, they may sit on the anthers, and as the anthers, they produce the pollen grains that are sticky. Those pollen grains, they're going to stick on the insects as the insects are getting nectar. And as the insects moves inside the flower, it may sit on the stigma, and as it sits on the stigma, it's going to transfer the pollen grains to the stigma. So that's how the nectaries contribute to pollination. Then the other adaptation is that these flowers are usually big or they are large in size. So the flowers are large in size, and the main reason why these flowers are large in size is so that they can be seen by the insects. So these are the adaptations of insect pollinated flowers. Let us look at the adaptations of wind pollinated flowers. So the adaptations of wind pollinated flowers are just the opposite to those of the insect pollinated flowers. So here the petals are not brightly colored. So the petals are not brightly colored. Then these types of flowers are not scented. So not scented. Then these types of flowers are usually small in size. So they are small in size. Then there is absence of nectar. So nectar is not present. Then here the stigmas are usually large and they are feathery. So the stigmas are large and they are feathery. The stigmas, they also hang outside the flower so that they can trap the pollen grains. So stigmas hang outside the flower. Then the other adaptation is that the pollen grains that are produced are usually small in size and they are light. So the pollen grains that are produced are small in size. So pollen grains are small in size and they are light. So that's all about insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. So the next thing that we're going to look at is fertilization in flowering plants. So fertilization is the fusion of the male gametes with the female gametes to form a zygote. It's the fusion of the male gametes with the female gametes to form the zygote. And in the flowering plants, the male gametes are the pollen grains and the female gametes are the ovule. So as pollination occurs, the pollen grains are going to stick on the stigma, and the stigma is going to produce a sticky substance that is going to make the pollen grains to stick on them. Also, the stigma is going to stimulate the pollen grains to start developing down the stem. So the pollen grains, they are going to develop the pollen tubes. So the pollen tubes will be developed, and as the pollen tube continue to develop here down the stem will be supplying the nutrients that are required for this pollen tube to develop downwards. And the other thing that you're supposed to know is that here the pollen grains contains two types of nucleus. So for the pollen grains, there are two types of nucleus. We have the pollen grain nucleus. We also have the generative nucleus. So for the pollen grain nucleus, this will be developing this pollen tube. That's the function of the pollen grain nucleus. So as the pollen tube continues to grow, it will grow down. Then as it reaches the ovule, it will enter the ovule through the micropyle. So the structure here is the micropyle. Then the pollen tube finally is going to enter the embryo sac. So as it enters the embryo sac, but before, so I was saying the pollen tube will enter the ovule through the micropyle. Then as it enters the embryo sac, here the pollen grain nucleus here is going to disintegrate. So it's going to disintegrate, and you're only going to remain with the generative nucleus. And the generative nucleus is divided into two male nuclei. So before the generative nucleus enters the embryo sac, it will divide into two male nuclei. Then as these two male nuclei enters the embryo sac, one of the male nuclei is going to fuse with the female egg nuclei, and as it fuses with the female egg nuclei, a diploid zygote is going to be formed. A diploid zygote is going to be formed, and the diploid zygote changes into the embryo. Then the other male nuclei is going to fuse with the polar nuclei. So the polar nuclei is made up of two. So we have two polar nuclei, and they'll form the triploid. They'll form the triploid nucleus. So the triploid nucleus is going to be formed, and this changes into the endosperm. It changes into the endosperm, and due to these processes, Fertilization in flowering plants is referred to as double fertilization. So fertilization in flowering plants is referred to as double fertilization. So that's the process of fertilization in flowering plants. So today we're going to look at fruit and seed dispersal. We're going to look at fruit and seed dispersal. So for a plant to continue to exist, it is important that it continues to produce the seeds, and the seeds have to be dispersed in a certain way. So the plants have to have various adaptation that will help them disperse their seeds. And there are different types of dispersal. We have animal dispersal. So we have animal, we have wind, we have self, we have water, we also have chance dispersal. But we're going to concentrate on animal, wind, self, and water dispersal. So we are going to start with wind dispersal. So we're going to start with wind. So here the fruits and the seeds are small and light to enable them to be carried away by the wind. So as the term suggests, wind dispersal, this means that the fruits and the seeds are dispersed by the wind. So the fruits and the seeds have to be light so that they can be carried by the wind. And for this type of dispersal, there is also the presence of paper, extension, wings, parachutes, or hair structure to create a large surface area. So here the seeds also have parachute structures, hair structures, so that to create a large surface area. So that's about wind. Let us look at water dispersal. So as the name suggests, water, this means that dispersal occurs through water. And for this type of dispersal, the fruits have airspace in the mesocarp, making them to be light and to be carried by water. This means that in the mesocarp of the fruits, there is a lot of space, and due to that, it will make those fruits to float on water. Also, it must be known that the fruits and the seed have waterproof pericarps. So the pericarps are waterproof, and this makes them not to soak in water, but they'll float on water, and they'll be transported to other regions where they can grow. Let us look at animal dispersal. So this is the type of dispersal that occurs through the animals. And for animal dispersal, here some fruits or seeds, they have hook structures which stick to the fur or hair or the clothes of the animals. Examples of those fruits are the blackjack. The blackjack usually stick to the fur, hair, or clothes of the animals. So for example, if you're walking in the bush, you're going to be the hookjack may stick to your clothes, and as you continue walking, you're going to discover that you have some hookjack, and you're going to try to remove them. So as you try to remove them and you put them down there, which means you as a person has acted as an agent of dispersal, because you have moved those hookjack from where the plant is to another region. So that's an example of animal dispersal. And the fruits that are dispersed by the animals, they are brightly colored so that they can attract the animals. It must also be known that the seed coat of these fruits, they are not usually digested by the animals, so they will come out of the animals through the feces as undigested, so they'll be dropped out as actual seeds, and as they are dropped out, they will be able to grow. So that's animal dispersal. Let us look at self-dispersal. So for the self-dispersal, the ponds dry up and spread along the lines of weakness, scattering the seeds far away from the plant. And examples of plants that can be dispersed by self, we have the beans. The beans, usually the ponds usually pop out, and the seeds, they may fall down. So that's all about the types of dispersal. So we have wind, water, animal, and self. We also have chance, but we have only concentrated on wind, water, animal, and self. Let us look at the importance of fruit and animal dispersal. So the importance of fruit and seed dispersal. So the first importance of fruit and seed dispersal is that this can make the seeds to explore new environment, and this new environment can be fertile. So the first importance here, the seeds can explore new environments, and these environments can be more fertile, and this can lead to actually the genetic improvement of the seed as it explores at the environment. Then the other importance of this is that the other importance of fruit and seed dispersal is that it prevents overcrowding. So this prevents overcrowding. And the other importance is that the spread of diseases is also checked since plants are far apart from each other. So the spread of diseases is also checked. So those are some of the importance of fruit and seed dispersal. Let us look at the best method of dispersal. So the best method of dispersal is described as the animal dispersal. This is because it helps to distribute the seeds in all direction and far apart from or far away from the parent, unlike other kinds of dispersal. For example, wind dispersal may lead to overcrowdedness, and due to overcrowdedness, the parents and the offsprings may start to compete for the nutrients, for the sunlight, and all that. So the best method of dispersal is animal dispersal, and this means that we are done with reproduction in flowering plants. So next time we're going to look at reproduction in human beings. Joshua Production, and today I'm going to share with you some past papers that I'm selling. So I'm selling some past papers with answers, and these are for mathematics, and I'm having the following years. I'm having for 2017, 2018, 2019 and 2020, and the price is only 20 kwacha soft copy, and that's per paper. And you can also get them at hard copy, which is 30 kwacha per paper. So immediately make a payment of the soft copies using Airtel or MTN mobile money. I'm going to send the papers on WhatsApp. So if you live nearby and if you want to get the hard copies, you can get them at 30 kwacha. And the importance of getting these past papers with answers is that they will help you to prepare for your exams. So the other thing that we do at Joshua Production, we capture some photos. So if you're having any celebration, let me say a wedding, a kitchen party, you can book us. So you can check out these samples that we did, and I'm going to put the link for my Facebook page for my photography. Further information, you can call me or text me on the number that is showing on the screen, which is 0973028620. I shall meet you next time.